Well, good evening, everyone. At last, here we are. And welcome to Heritage Talks, a program by the Quebec Anglophone Heritage Network. My name is Heather Darch, and I'm a project director for Quan and your host this evening. Our series, Sharing Our Heritage, Inspiring Stories from Across Quebec's Heritage Community, is going to be a great opportunity to hear from people who work or volunteer in organizations across the province and who are going to tell us about their community's history, their special projects, and their inspiring stories. Quan is a nonprofit organization whose mission is to preserve and promote the history and heritage of Quebec, but of the English-speaking peoples in particular, right across the province. Now, if you're joining us for the first time for Heritage Talks, we would love if you became a member of Quan, and we actually have a special deal for this evening. You can take advantage of a 30% discount. That's $20 for a one-year membership. And it gives you access to all kinds of programming that we do and publications, including our quarterly magazine, Quebec Heritage News. So if you're interested and you'd like to claim your membership, you can simply send $20 to home@qahn.org or using PayPal or Interact e-transfer. And be sure to include your name and email and address as well. Or you can send a check. We do like to go old-fashioned, and you can send a check to our office with your address as well. And be sure to mention the special deal and what program you were watching. I would like to thank the funders who make this program possible, Canadian Heritage, the Zeller Family Foundation, and the Townshippers Foundation. All of our presentations are recorded, so if you've missed any, you can go to Quan's Facebook page, and it is a public site, so you don't need a Facebook page of your own. You can go there and hear all our past recordings for several years, in fact. If you're joining us on Zoom today, please keep your camera turned off during the presentation. You may turn your camera back on when our speaker is finished. And actually, I would love it if you did, so we could create a community and our speaker can see you all and who's asking the questions. If you would like to ask a question at the end, you can click on the raise hand icon in the reactions box at the bottom of your screen to get our attention. And Allison, my trusty assistant, will unmute you. You can also type a question or comment in the Zoom chat box, and I'll read it to our speaker. And if that is completely overwhelming, you can go really old school and just wave your hands around, and we'll see you. Our guest this evening is Jane Jensen. Jane has been on the executive of the Société d'Histoire de Canton d'Orford since its creation in 2019. A professor emeritus of political science at the Université de Montréal, in her retirement, she turned to research on the social history of Canton d'Orford and the Eastern Townships more generally. Her publications about 19th century Orford and soldiers from the townships who fought in the American Civil War have appeared in Quebec Heritage News, the Canadian Historical Review, and Histoire Sociale, Social History. In 2023, she was awarded a Prix du Québec, the Prix Léon Guérin, for an outstanding career in the social sciences. We welcome Jane Jensen tonight with her talk, John Buzzell's Diary, A Year in a Life in Cherry River, Orford Township, 1916 to 1917. Good evening, Jane, and welcome to Heritage Talks.
Thank you, Heather. Thank you so much for the invitation and for the opportunity to speak to Quan members, supporters, and visitors. And sorry for the delay in the start. It was a technical problem on my end. So I'm just going to put up my PowerPoint and accept that Allison has to give me permission to share the screen. If you can do that, Allison.
Yeah, I think if you double checked, you have permission. I made you a co-host at the beginning of
I'm a co-host. Okay, sorry about that. Didn't
no
recognize
problem.
myself as a co-host. Okay. So here we go. So I'm going to talk today, as Heather's already said, about John Buzzell's diary and 1 year of this diary that he wrote in 1916, 1917. Just a second, I'm having some trouble with the moving my PowerPoint. Okay, the diary itself, the whole book, which you see on the right, the original copy, runs from the 1st of March. He opened the book and started writing, and he finished and closed the book, signed his name in December 1918. The diary was loaned to the Société d'Histoire du Canton d'Orford, the SHCO, by his great grandson, Wallace Moffat, who you can see sitting in the photo on the left. And the diary itself, plus some accompanying material, is now deposited at the Eastern Townships Research Center by Wallace Moffat and his family, so that it can be consulted by other people. But there are copies of there's a scanned copy of the year that I'm going to talk about, the handwritten part, also on the SHCO website. The Alan Albright, who's the man standing on the right in the blue shirt, and myself transcribed 1 year of the diary from March 1916 to March 1917, plus a few days in November 1917. And we did this over the summer of 2022. And then we published as the book that I've showed you the cover of, an analytic essay, the transcription itself, and a list of the cast of characters. This book is published in English and in French and is available from the SHCO website, or for anyone who might be interested, you can contact me and buy a hard, as we used to call them, a hard copy of the book. So I'm going to talk to you today about John Buzzell's diary, but before doing that, and since people come from across Quebec, I thought I would locate Cherry River. And as you can see on the map, it's slightly north of Magog, about 5 kilometers north of Magog, to the west of Sherbrooke, just at the top of Lake Memphremagog. The Cherry River itself, which runs from Mount Orford down through the town, runs eventually into Lake Memphremagog. So that's where it is geographically. The village in which John Buzzell lived was settled starting from the late 1850s. It was a village in an agroforestry economy with small farms, with 2 sawmills in the village itself, and with a tub shop. If you look at this picture, which was also used for the advertising the talk, the tub shop is on the left. The sawmill that at one point belonged to the Buzzells is on the right. And we like to believe, though we don't have any real evidence for this, but we like to believe that the man driving the horse and cart in the picture is John Buzzell on his way home. But this is clearly a picture of what was the center of Cherry River in the beginning of the 20th century. Now, the Buzzell family has been in Cherry River from the late 1850s, and most of them arriving in the 1860s. John himself was born in 1850, and he was the 13th and last child of Daniel Taylor Buzzell and Mary Jane Fuller. He arrived with his parents and several siblings in Cherry River in 1862. They came originally from Bolton Pass, stopping for a year or two in another part of Bolton, and then moving to Cherry River. They went there, as we can see on the Putnam and Gray map of 1863, they went there to join several of his older siblings. He was the youngest, but several of his older siblings were already established in Cherry River. So that when the Putnam and Gray map was made in 1863, there were already 5 Buzzell families listed on the map. Daniel Taylor, the father, and Mary Jane Fuller, the mother. Then Abel Buzzell and Hannah Maria Norton. Abel was the oldest son. Adam Sager and Felina Buzzell. Felina was one of the oldest daughters. William Baird and Aurora Buzzell. and Simeon Powers and Anna Buzzell. So there were 5 Buzzell families already living in Cherry River in the 1860s. But 10 of the 13 children stayed in the village or stayed nearby in Magog. And that among the 10 were 6 sons to continue the Buzzell name. So in many ways, Cherry River is known as the home of the Buzzell family. In November 1870, John Buzzell married Juliet Louise Wilson in Derby, Vermont. Juliet was known as Julia, and I'll always refer to her as Julia, as did John in the diary. She was from Stansted, born in Stansted and raised in Stansted. Her parents, David Wilson and Abigail Heath, had 7 daughters, and 4 of those daughters married a Buzzell. Obviously, Julia married John, but 3 of her sisters married 3 sons of his oldest brother, Abel Buzzell and Hannah Maria Norton. So the result of this is that in the diary and in the material I'm going to talk to you about today, many of John's grandnephews and grandnieces were Julia's nephews and nieces, so that the families were very much intertwined in the village, and this was important for the way that John Buzzell did his work. The family of John and Julia was composed of 7 children, 5 of whom were still living in 1916, 1917, when he wrote the diary. On the left, you can see a picture from the 1930s in Paris, Ontario. It'll become clear in a minute why Paris, Ontario was the location of this picture. And you can see John, who by this time was well into his 70s, if not his 80s, and he's with his second wife, not Julia, but with Edith Dukes Drew. But in 1916, which is the year that we're interested in, he had 5 living children. So because the oldest daughter, Myrtle, had died young, the oldest son, Jerome Hamilton, had died young. So the 5 who were still living in 1916 were Lavinia, always known as Vin, who was living in Magog. This is the family of Wallace Moffat, who lent us the diary. He had 2 daughters who were living in Paris, Ontario, always referred to in the diary as Paris, Ontario, to keep it clear that it wasn't Paris, France. And in Paris, Ontario, Nellie Maria was living with George William McFarlane, and Rosemary was living with George Cass. They were working, George William McFarlane had what was called a shell factory. It was making armaments for the First World War. And he had his son Archie, who was living in Bromptonville, and his last, the baby son, who was in his 30s by now, but he was working in Montreal, although his wife and daughter were still living in Cherry River in 1960. So that's his family, and the family plays a major role in the diary, and he tells us quite a bit about them. So if we step back from the details of John and Julia's life and their family, what are the lessons that we might take away, or what kinds of things can we learn from 1 year of a diary? What can it tell us about life in Cherry River? I'm going to take a few minutes to talk about this, but still focusing on the example of John Buzzell. So John Buzzell was a man of many talents, many skills, but he lived in an age of multitasking. While he was had many skills, so did others in the area. So this was a kind of common way or common form of work life in Cherry River at the time. So in the 1880s, Julia and John bought farmland and built a house and they raised the 7 children in the house, which you can see the picture of here. It was on the western side of Cherry River, close to the cemetery. You can still visit the cemetery today in Cherry River. So they bought farmland and they operated a small farm. It was relatively small, but they still had cattle or cows. They had chickens. They grew various crops. But also during these years, he always had other jobs. If you noticed on the marriage certificate, he was listed as being a carpenter and joiner. And he owned for a number of years at the end of the 19th century with his brother Robert, the tub shop, where they manufactured wooden items, particularly butter boxes, but a number of other wooden items. And so he was an entrepreneur in addition to being a farmer. For a number of years around 1901, when the children were old enough to work, Julia and John moved to Magog. They lived in Magog with the unmarried children who worked at Dominion Textile. Lavinia and Nellie, the 2 older daughters, were already married and also living in Magog, with their husbands also working at Dominion Textile. But the sort of still core family living together was John as a carpenter joiner, Rose, who was working in the folding room of Dominion Textiles, Jerome, who was a machinist, Archie, who at the age of 16 was overseeing a spinning machine, and Leslie, who was the youngest and who was still in school. However, when we get to the year of the diary, by 1916, all of the children had married, and John and Julia were back in Cherry River on the farm and operating the farm. So he tells us a lot about the work on the farm. On his birthday was 17 August, and his 66th birthday was in the year of the diary. And as you can see, this is taken from the diary. He says, "This is my birthday, 66 years old today. I went to Magog in the forenoon. In the afternoon, I raked oats. Archie came again." This is a very typical entry, even though it's his birthday. He just mentions his birthday and then tells us what he did, which was to make a trip to Magog, probably to sell something, and then to work on the farm. The diary also recounts 2 weeks, one in March and one in December, when he went up into his bush lot, took his horse and his sled, and he brought down wood, and then he drew, which was the verb he always used, he drew his wood back to the farm, and then he spent time chopping it to make it into both firewood, and in the March group, he was also making fence posts. So this is the kind of work that he would do and schedule it every year to undertake it. Over the 3 growing seasons, he planted and harvested potatoes and beans. He hayed. He killed several animals in the fall as the frost came on. The animals were all both for a pig for family consumption, but he also sold his cows in Magog. He cut brush in the pastures, and he did all of the rest of the things that any farmer would have to do. So this was a lot of hard work that he was engaged in. His diary tells us nothing about what Julia did, but she was responsible in her work as and in her part of contribution to the farm. She was responsible for the things that were exchanged in Magog to provide cash and to do bartering in Magog. So he's almost every week he took eggs and butter, and then also in the correct season he would take his vegetables, and to a Vaughan Brothers store, which was in Magog near the train station. And you can see in this citation from the diary that I went to Magog, the roads were bad. I let Vaughan have 10 dozen eggs and 9 pounds of butter. And he tells us the price that Vaughan quoted for the for getting the eggs and getting the butter, he records that amount, but in return, in the barter exchange, he got 8 pounds of codfish, 2 madrona, and some tea. So that this was a relationship in which he was basically doing bartering. Very rarely did he actually receive money from Vaughan. It was more an exchange of things that couldn't be grown on the farm, and he would go and get those in Magog. But without any sons, because none of his sons lived in Cherry River, they were all working either in Bromptonville or in Montreal. So without sons in Cherry River to help with the farm, he had to hire, and he was 66 years old. He hired his nephews, or often his grandnephews, of which he had a large number of them. But if he was going to hire them, he needed cash. And the cash, for the most part, came from his work with Prouty and Miller. Prouty and Miller was a major logging firms located in Newport, Vermont, that owned a great deal of land on Mount Orford and the surrounding Cherry River. So he had a job from December to May working for J.B. Oliver, who was the agent for Prouty and Miller in Magog. And he looked after the landing. So you can see in this quotation that he describes his work on the landing, keeping it in order and receiving deliveries, because he received deliveries of logs through the winter months. They were delivered by horse and sled to the landing, and he would have to pile them, and also he would have to scale them. One of the things that he was quite skilled at was scaling logs, which is the measuring of logs and the calculation of their value. And he did that for Prouty and Miller, not only in Cherry River, but he also traveled around in other parts of Magog and down towards Stansted, scaling logs. This is a highly skilled job that he did for the logging company. So that was what he did for Prouty and Miller. But in addition, every spring, he was involved in organizing the log drive down from down the Cherry River from Mount Orford and also from further to the east. He spent several days booming the bog. This is the what is now the Marais in Magog. You can visit the Marais. And the logs were collected in the bog within a boom and then transferred to the top of Lake Memphremagog, where they were either kept in booms, as you can see in the picture at the bottom, and dragged to Newport, or if it was hardwood, they were put onto these large boats and shipped to Newport. So this was his job, in addition to the farm, was working for Prouty and Miller. And the journal describes this work in a great deal of detail, including who he hired, how much he paid, or how many hours the men worked for him, and how much he earned. So if you can see on this quotation from the diary, he says that he spent a day doing some figuring to figure out the bills and who was owed what. And then he went to Magog, and J.B. Oliver paid him for his 18 days work on the landing, and he was paid in full. And I unfortunately can't see the amount because I have little pictures on the right, but hopefully you can read it. So the diary also contained these kinds of calculations of earnings, both by himself and by the people that he hired. So this was his work for Prouty and Miller. Now, this diary, which I've been talking about, is can be described as a very typical rural diary. On the right, I've just given you one page as an example of what we read and what we transcribed. With the keeping of a rural diary, many of which, the major or the majority of diaries were kept by men. It's a form that was very popular throughout the second half of the 19th century and into the 20th century. It was encouraged for farmers to keep track of their work in these kinds of diaries. So that the diaries recount the daily activities in very short information, as you can see. I went, I did, but very clear detail. So he tells us what he accomplished. He tells us about the trips to Magog, basically for buying and selling, but also often for picking up Leslie at the train, because Leslie would come from Montreal on the train. He tells us about his visitors and visiting, who visited, what they were, why they came by, and those kinds of things. He tells us about the health of family members and many neighbors. For example, there was a measles epidemic in 1917 in Cherry River, and he was extremely worried about that. And he tells us about the activities of his neighbors. Even if he's not involved, he'll tell us something that happened to someone. So at the very bottom of the page, you can see that J.B. Oliver came over. He'd been over at T.J. Stock's place, which is Lake Brompton. When he was driving back, he got caught in a big shower and got his pants wet, and I got some hay wet. So these are the kinds of stories of the neighborhood that were considered to be important to include in the diary. By keeping it this kind of detail about work, he gives a record of farm dates as well as about marriages and deaths. Obviously, he only records the marriages and deaths of people that he wants to, so you can't treat it as a census. But he does give us a lot of information about who was getting married and who was dying. And he gives a very good account of the weather. In fact, when I took the book to the archive at the Eastern Townships Research Center, Jasmine Aldridge, the archivist, told me that there's a geographer, I think at McGill, who's collecting these diaries to try and reproduce the weather of the 19th and early 20th century, because they kept really good track of what was happening. First snows, warm spells, heavy rains, that kind of thing. And obviously the diary, though it's not on this page, but on previous pages, was an account book where he kept track of how much he earned, how much he spent, and that kind of thing. So it's very typical. But what does this kind of diary not tell us about life in Cherry River? And here it was also a very typical diary, because it doesn't tell us a lot of things. It describes the weather, the work, and describes life in the neighborhood. And this is very important because it was only in the neighborhood. So he was very sociable, John Buzzell. When we created, Alan Albright and I created our list of the cast of characters, we ended up with exactly 100 people who were mentioned within the 12-month period. Some of them several times over, but there were 100 different people. But in that year, he mentioned his daughters in Paris, Ontario, only once. So that the daughters, and there was absolutely no estrangement from these daughters, but the activities in Paris, Ontario were not something that you recorded in the diary. It was, you recorded what was happening in the immediate neighborhood. He doesn't say anything about World War I. This bothered me a lot because I thought, well, this is very strange because we're in the middle of World War I, and 1916 was a terrible year for the war, and it's as if for John Buzzell it's not happening. And at the very end of the diary, he writes, almost on the last page, war ended November 11th, and that's it. That's the only time he mentions the war. this was not because he was uninformed or uninterested. He took a newspaper, he read the newspaper, he spent a lot of time describing his sending in his subscription to the Montreal Star, when it was mailed, how much he put in the envelope, etc. But he was in this not mentioning these kinds of world events. He was hewing again to the rules of a typical rural diary, where those events outside of the neighborhood and what we called, when we were going to school, current events, were not something that were recorded. And so he would mention them hardly at all. The whole year of the diary that we transcribed, he mentioned one thing, which was the collapse of the Quebec Bridge. So he was informed. He read his newspaper, but he didn't tell us about it in the diary. This is important if you're using diaries to try and know what was going on and what people were thinking about, because they were just the rules of diary keeping discourage that kind of writing. And I promised I would give a plug to Quebec Heritage News. So in the next issue, the winter issue, I have an article coming out, a very short article about the diary called Lots of Weather But No War, and reading a rural diary in the townships. So very typical. It was also typical because the explicit expression of emotions was also absent from such rural diaries. It was not encouraged. These were not diaries of young women coming to adulthood, talking about their inner lives. It was very factual, very neighborhood centered. So the events are baldly stated as fact. And this one, when I first read it, I thought, oh my God, what is this? So he says, Levi Richardson died this morning at about 2 a.m., a nice day. And I read that and I said, oh. And then I realized that I was supposed to pause. Levi Richardson died this morning at about 2 a.m. Take time, and then I have a weather report, a nice day. This was not a private journal where thoughts, fears, emotions, and so on are expressed. So his brother Myron died in 1916. And we see again here, Myron died this morning, just past 2 o'clock. I went to Magog. J.B. Oliver gave me a check. And we might think, well, so he doesn't care about his brother dying. That's just, an event. But no, we see with the black line, the heavy black line, is the only place in the whole diary that he put in this kind of a mark. And he was clearly signaling the end of something to mark off Myron's death, even though he stated it in this very bald and factual way. And in the days beforehand, as in the 5th, Monday the 5th, but for several days back into May, he was worried about Myron and reporting on Myron's illness. But as a typical rural diary, he didn't use it to express his emotions. He told us that Myron died, and we have to read the dark line and the mentions of his health as a sign of his concerns. It was also a diary. It was also a public document. It wasn't a secret document. It wasn't something that you put away under lock and key. It was used for multiple purposes, including, in this case, as you can see from the example, for his granddaughter to practice her penmanship. So at the bottom of this page, you see that there was a big visit. Sadie came. Leslie went and got Sadie and brought her down for dinner. She had been in the hospital and they were very concerned about her. And so then she wrote her name and the date in the diary. And there's throughout the year, there's several places where Sadie wrote something in the diary. So it was a public document consulted by other members of the family, including children. And it was meant to be open and with open to others. The exception, of course, with Julia's death on the 1st of November, 1917, there he several times expressed his pain and sadness. But he also quickly returned to his accounting of how much he paid the doctor, how much he paid the undertaker. So that, again, he pulled himself back and under control, keeping his distress at her death for his own feelings, but not in the diary itself. So this means that if you're going to use these diaries, you have to think carefully about what people were willing to tell, why they might say things in a way that they did, and what the limits of them as a source of information. They're very useful sources of information, but they require interpretation. You can't do it in an unmediated way. So the diary draws to a close. My talk is coming to a close too. John Buzzell after Cherry River. Julia died suddenly the 1st of November. The children came back from Paris immediately. They organized the funeral. They convinced John to move to Paris, Ontario. They organized an auction selling all of the farm goods, the animals, and the household goods. And on the 22nd of November, so 22 days later, he was on the train moving to Paris, Ontario, where he lived with Nellie and George William McFarlane. The diary kept going after November 1917. It recounts his efforts to keep up his life in his diary while living in Ontario. But it quickly became clear that he was isolated. He was with his family, and he appreciated that. But he had lived in this rich network of lifelong friendships and multiple family members for more than 65 years. And he all of a sudden was no longer in those networks, had those contacts. And he tried for a number of weeks to write about what other people were doing in his new neighborhood, but he gradually just dropped that off, and he had nothing to write about but how many hours he worked and how much he earned working in the shell factory, because his son-in-law gave him a job in the shell factory. And so it's very sad reading the end of the diary, because I'm not a psychiatrist. I can't say he was depressed, but he was certainly not happy and not having the same kind of enjoyment that he had had in his life in Cherry River. So he returned to Magog after he closed the diary in November, December 1918, signed his name. Sometime later, he moved back to Magog, remarried, and lived in Magog with his second wife until her death, when he moved yet again to Paris, Ontario, and died in 1944. So what does this kind of thick description tell us about life in the townships? Why is it worth listening to me talk about John Buzzell's diary and spending the time to read these diaries with great care? Because when you read them, you have, not only are they difficult to decipher, but you also have to figure out what it is that he means. So what can they tell us? This is an interesting diary, because John Buzzell had arrived in Cherry River during its initial colonization. It was still very much an area under being opened up to settlement. In 1916, 1917, he was still living in an agroforestry economy, though obviously it was much different from the 1860s. And he describes his life there and his farming and also the work on the landing. But the diary also describes what industrialization was doing to that familiar society. Geographical mobility was the norm, so that the children moved around a lot. Leslie went back and forth on the train between Montreal and Magog several times a month, sometimes weekly. It was easy to get to Sherbrooke on the train. They went to Sherbrooke for various kinds of medical emergencies. Archie bought a car. He was doing well in his work in Bromptonville, bought a car, and he went back and forth between Bromptonville and Cherry River and Magog, where not only his parents, but also his wife's parents lived. So there was lots of movement out of Cherry River and around. But there was also social mobility. Nellie and Rosemary's families were living middle-class lives of factory owners in Ontario. Vin's family, the Moffats, lived in Magog, and where John Moffat was earning very good wages at Dominion Textile, and they had a house in the center of town. So that the children were living in very different lives than what their parents had lived in the Cherry River of the years of colonization and later development. None of the children chose to live on the farm. They were all working in industrial jobs, similar to those that they'd had during their adolescence when Julia and John moved to Magog for a number of years, and they all worked at Dominion Textiles. Even John Buzzell didn't return to Cherry River. He lived his retirement when he came back from his first trip to Paris, or his first time in Paris, Ontario. He lived in Magog, and on the same street, there were several people of a similar age who were also from Cherry River, so that he was living in a more urban setting than Cherry River. So what the diary, I think, describes is a year of a life that's balanced between an ending, which is both a personal ending as he was getting older, but the ending of a historical era for the townships, and was on the cusp of a new era, one which would be more industrial and eventually more focused on tourism and services than on the farming and forestry that Cherry River had been so well known for. So thank you very much, and I look forward to your comments and questions.
Thank you very much, Jane. What a marvelous talk, a fascinating window on, I guess you could say it's an ordinary life, like many other townshippers at the time, but you realize that the story is in those details. The fragments and the seemingly mundane entries are actually really rich in the texture of everyday life. So it's a marvelous story, and I'm so glad you brought it to us tonight. Now, I hope that the people will turn their cameras on so Jane can see you, and we can open up some questions and see if people have comments. I'll just make sure I move myself out of the way. There we go. Okay. And if you have any questions, you can go to the bottom of the screen where it says, or you can use the chat if you'd like, but you can also find the raise hand caption in the reactions button, and we'll be able to see if you have any questions. And you can just wave your hands around as well. I'll start it off, Jane, and why do you think that at the age of 66 that John Buzzell picked up a pen and started to write a diary? Do you have a sense that he wrote one much earlier in his life, or it just seems odd as such in the later years he would start to keep a diary?
Yeah, I mean, I've thought about that, and I really don't know the answer. Wally Moffat is actually on the call if he, or on the Zoom if he maybe has an answer for his great-grandfather. But my suspicion is that he kept diaries before. We just don't have them. And that, as I said, it was a very, very common thing. Guelph University has this very interesting collection of diaries of people, as you've said, about ordinary people, ordinary lives. And Catherine Ann Wilson and other colleagues have collected these over the years, and many of them are online. And you read them, and they're very, very similar. And people are they're trying to do two things. They're trying to keep a record for themselves, and so for his work, you know, when did he plant and when did he hay? But by the time he was 66, his farming, he pretty much had that under control, I think. And also to keep track, just to keep track of things. So I suspect he wrote diaries earlier, but we don't have them. I have I've seen references in Juanita McKelvey's work to a later diary, which sounds much more like a kind of family history, but I haven't seen that. So we just took this one as a document, sort of standalone document. But it wasn't unusual for men or for women of that age to write diaries for all of the reasons of keeping track and keeping dates straight and that kind of thing.
I've seen diaries like this before, and I think in the past it was easy for historians really to dismiss them because they just seemed to be about weather and mundane things. But you realize that it's a rich tapestry of information about an entire community when you look carefully at these kinds of diaries.
Yeah, well, I mean, one of the things that is sort of a shame is that we did 1 year because we. I can't speak for Alan, but because he actually did more afterwards, but I got really bored. I said, this is really boring. He's just, nice weather, went to Magog, sold a chicken, that kind of stuff. And it was only after we had finished the transcription and I started to try and make sense of it that I went back and used Alan's later, the transcriptions that Alan had done just for himself, and also kept rereading it because the more you read it, the more interesting it gets. But the first, I said to him, okay, we're not devoting our life to this diary. We'll go March 1, and that's enough. And so that because it really, when you're on your first reading, is really not very exciting.
I like how you realize there was the absence of stories as well. The World War was going on all around and the turmoil of society at the time, but he was very focused. I found that very fascinating that you picked that up. I wouldn't have even thought of that.
And it wasn't until I read, in part because of reading Jack Little, who's also on the Zoom, and he did his diary from the Eastern Township in the 19th century too. And there's a woman who wrote about these kinds of diaries in the United States. I found the reference in Jack's book, and she has a reference to the fact that farmers in the midst of the Civil War wouldn't say anything about the Civil War, with one exception, which is if a son went to war, then it would be mentioned, Joseph joined the army or Joseph went to war, but that was it. The Civil War was clearly affecting people, but that's not what the diaries were meant to be about. So in that sense, that's why I insist on it being a rural diary as opposed to life writing or many of the diaries that have been analyzed about coming of age. That's not what it is, and it's a particular kind of diary. But now that I've worked on it so much, I find it really fascinating.
Yeah, and also the absence of what Julia was doing, because she was working like a crazy thing probably, but you sort of have a sense that when he's selling butter, that maybe that Julia is the one that actually made the butter. And
of course, she did, and all the eggs that went every week were
right.
Julia's chickens. We know that from all of the work that's been done in women's history and the division of labor and farm work.
There's a nice comment from Susan Hall. She said, it was interesting to see the note in the diary about Myron Buzzell's death. Myron was my second great-grandfather.
Ah, right.
And then Kenneth Crothers from Facebook says, my grandmother was a Catchpaw Liette. My father was born in 1916, the year of the diary, and the name Catchpaw or Catchpaw, spelled differently, was the same Catchpaw named in the diary. Do you happen to know that?
Oh yeah, no. There was a Catchpaw family. They're still in Cherry River, and I don't know. I can't remember now who was named in the diary, but it's all in some sense the same family.
I don't know that area of the townships very well, so this may be a silly question, but are there lots of Buzzells still around?
I don't know. There are some, but whether there's a lot, I haven't looked at the phone book, so
Okay.
I couldn't say. I think Judy
I see
Bachelor
that Judy is waving her hand, yay, and Allison will unmute you in a second, Judy. There you go.
Yeah. John was my great-grandfather's brother, and somehow or other, I ended up with his diary from 1933 to 1936.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And mostly he's talking about people dying, especially his dear Edie. He tells about that. Somehow or other, this got to my grandmother, who was Ralph Buzzell's wife, and she has a few things, like Judy had measles when she was 5 and tells about it. So there's a little bit about me in this too, which is kind of interesting.
Yeah, yeah. But
So,
is it the same? Is it the same sort of format of very short things, or does he write
yeah.
paragraphs?
When it got to Edie, he told a lot about Edie dying. It was obviously it was touching to him, but
Yeah,
mostly it's so and so died, and that's about it.
yeah, yeah.
Well, that's fascinating. Thanks,
Yeah.
Judy, for sharing that.
Yeah, well,
another project.
I would love to see it sometime.
Maybe we could put you in contact with each other.
Yeah, that would be great.
Okay, that's great, Judy. Judy, if you'd like to send us your email, or we can connect you through to Jane for sure. That would be great. You can just contact the Quan office or send us a Facebook message. That would be great. Thank you. Now, here we have another comment from Louise Gendron. My grandfather was T.J. Stocks. My mother, 88, who was his youngest child. T.J. Stocks was 60 when she was born.
Wow. That's really interesting because he was somewhere in Brompton. That's as far as I've been able to figure out. And but Gendron, there were lots of Gendrons around the northern part of Orford. So perhaps Louise is related to all of those things. And she says she wants to purchase the book, which is great. And maybe you can contact the History Society if you just search on the Société d'Histoire du Canton d'Orford, and you can find how to you can get the email address, and I'll get back to you about it.
That's great. And if you get confused, you can also contact the Quan office, and we can direct you to the right contacts for sure.
Good.
Here's another one from Facebook, Charles Neville Ross. In the 1960s, a friend of mine dove into Lake Magog to retrieve sunken logs. He said it was virgin timber and must have sunk before they were loaded onto the ships. It was very valuable.
Well, there was a huge amount of logging, both off of Mount Orford and from different areas through Magog. And all along from Magog, there were landings, right? With the Cherry River landing was only one of the landings, along with Knowlton Landing and those others, where they would load the wood. And as I said, the hardwood had to go on boats, on barges, because otherwise it would sink. So they must have lost. And then booms, even with softwood, booms would break and they would lose logs here and there. But there were a lot of movement on the lake at the time.
Is that what brought the Buzzells initially to that part of the townships? Was the opportunity for logging and work? And
well, I mean, Daniel Taylor, like his father before him, his father was the first immigrant from the United States, and he came with Nicholas Austin, and they settled in Bolton, and they farmed, but they also ran sawmills and various kinds of. They produced wood products, sometimes furniture, sometimes butter boxes, sometimes things. And so they came to Cherry River, I assume, because of the wood supply and the possibilities for a sawmill. They very quickly opened a sawmill on the Cherry River.
Is there much left Cherry River today?
Oh yeah, no, it's a great place. You should come by and visit.
I'll have to take off the auto route then. Yeah, I usually
Right,
just drive to Sherbrooke. So, okay,
right.
I'll come looking for it. This past summer, Allison Kirkwood and I were tromping around the cemetery of the Fuller family in a place called Lost Nation in Bolton. So, and that's Julia's family, I would assume, the Fullers from that area.
No, Mary Jane Fuller. Yeah, I don't know. I don't really know much about her family and the Wilsons. I don't know much about either, just that they were around Stansted. But for your cemetery project, you certainly should check out the Cherry River Cemetery, because it's been there from the 1870s, 1880s.
I will. Thank you. Kwan loves to find the cemeteries and talk about them. So indeed,
Right.
we'll go find it. I
Mhm.
don't see that there are any other people with questions. Oh, there we have Susan Hall. Hi, Susan. You'll be unmuted in just a sec. Just a sec. Allison will get you.
There we go.
There.
I was just going to ask you where you found the cemetery, where the Fuller Cemetery, because I tried to find it a couple of summers ago, and we went through, there was a whole construction site, and we couldn't actually get to the cemetery anymore. I wanted, because I'm descended from the tail, like from that family, and I was trying to find Mary Jane Fuller's where she was buried.
Well, I think she's buried in Cherry River.
Mary Jane Fuller?
Mm-hmm. She lived in Cherry River for most of her life. Maybe not, but I have to look
I
at
was
the list.
pretty sure she would. Most of them were buried in the Fuller Cemetery.
Okay, well, I have to check.
Okay. We went looking for it and we couldn't find it. Like, it was a construction site and you had to go up and around, and it's a pit where they're digging, and they've actually left the cemetery up on top of where there's no access to it anymore. Yeah.
Yeah, the Fuller site. Yes, we discovered that. Almost getting lost in the woods trying to find it. So
Did you find it though?
we did eventually. Yeah, we did. And actually Kwan is in on February 18th, we're releasing new mini film series on called Raising Spirits. It's going to be on our YouTube page. And you can go and see one of the places we went to was the Fuller Cemetery.
Oh, perfect.
And that's a place called Lost Nation. So it's a really great story. So so after February 18th, you can check out Kwan's YouTube channel for that. There'll be some more notices on our Facebook page and website soon too. So
okay, perfect. Thank you.
You're welcome. Here's a comment from Charles Neville Ross. Was there any mention of the Turner family? As my mom was born in Cherry River in 1912, she must have met them, as the name Buzzell's name came up in every discussion.
Hang on a second. I'll have to look up my list to see if we had a Turner. No, he wasn't in the 1 year, but certainly the Turners were in the town, and so it's. But you know, he had his connections, and other people had you know, and he wasn't. One of the things that's interesting is that there were several families that were kind of founding families. And their interactions were not, even though it was a little town, everyone didn't interact with everyone else. So, for example, the Aldriches, who were related to the Hoyts, and who was one of the founding families from the 1840s. There were no Aldriches mentioned in John Buzzell's diary, and they seem to have, just sort of move in different circles. And my suspicion, though I don't know whether this is true or not, that it was in some sense related to religious differences, that John Buzzell and his family were Methodists, and many of the people in Cherry River were Second Adventists. And so I wouldn't say that they were necessarily in conflict, but they just didn't move in the same social circles. And his social circle was very much the Methodists of Magog, where the church was on what's that street in Magog that we drive down all the time? Mary. There was the new Methodist church was built just before the diary, and the Reverend Roy came frequently for the burials, and so he was very much in that kind of social world of Methodists in Magog. And then there were these the Adventists who were in a different different religious grouping. And the Turners, I'm sorry, I just don't know anything about.
We certainly have people who are connected into Cherry River watching tonight. Christine says, we found my husband's great-grandfather's name there, Cecil Powers. And yes, Christine, this is a recorded session, so you'll be able to rewatch this again. She asked that. And then Jennifer Perkins said, my husband, Jonathan Moffat, is Robert Moffat's grandson and Wally's nephew.
Right.
Yeah. So thank you, everybody, for making comments and identifying how you are connected to this story. It's quite something, isn't it, Jane, that you realize this, such a small, simple diary written so tersely is so inspiring to people, and can reach out into the community and inform us what life was like and what the neighborhood was doing at the time.
Right. Okay. Well, just before we go, I want to thank Wally Moffat yet again for contacting me and suggesting that the History Society might be interested in the diary. And I want to thank Alan Albright, who's in Florida, and for whatever reason couldn't come in. Thank him for working on it, because it really was a joint project of the two of us trying to make sense of and read the diary. And I want to thank my colleagues from the History Society, several who are here tonight, for their help in the analysis and in writing the essay. And again, it is on the website, both our analysis, the transcription, so it's legible, and the original handwritten 1 year of the handwritten diaries. So it's all on the website in English and in French. And so I hope that people will, if you're interested in, particularly for your relatives, the cast of characters is very interesting to see all of the interconnections of the people the 100 people who he had dealings with in the course of 1 year.
Well, I'd like to thank you, Jane, very much for this very interesting presentation this evening. It's been really quite wonderful to hear about Mr. Buzzell, a man that made a difference to his community and a difference to his family, and Thank goodness he wrote something down, because we have this little window into his life and the community of Cherry River. So thank you very much.
Okay,
And thank you to all of you who joined us this evening as well. And I hope you can join us for our next Heritage Talk presentation. It's called Finding Home in Brome County by Rachel Lambie on Sunday, February 4th, starting at 1 o'clock. And this is an in-person and online event, so you can join us right here on Zoom or on Facebook Live at 1 o'clock, or actually come to the Black Brome Museum, 15 Chemin St. Paul in Knowlton, to hear the presentation in person and enjoy some coffee and tea and conversation. And you can find the entire speaker lineup to come, and you can listen to the ones that you've missed on Quan's website at qahn.org or on our Facebook page. And from there, you can register to Zoom. So thank you very much, Allison Kirkwood in Master Control, keeping us all connected. And thank you again for all of you for coming tonight. And again, Jane, thank you so much.
well, thank you.
That's it, everyone. Good night.
Bye-bye.